There is a line on a form where you write that a soldier is not coming home, and I have written it exactly once. I remember the pen. It was a cheap black government pen with the cap chewed by somebody before me, and it skipped on the first stroke so that the R in her last name came out thin, and I pressed harder, and the second letter tore a little pit in the paper. That is the kind of thing you remember when the rest of the day has gone to smoke in your head. Not the sound of the rotors, not the shouting. The chewed cap of a pen, and the thin R, and the small torn pit where I bore down. I put her down as killed in action because that is what I believed, and because I was the senior man on the ground and belief was my job. We had left her in a dry riverbed in the Sadr Valley with the light going and the enemy closing and two of our own already bleeding out in the trucks, and I had made the call that no one else would make, which is the call you are put there to make. You count the living. You get the living out. You do not spend 3 more men to carry a fourth who is not moving and not answering and lying where a machine gun can reach. I counted. I got the living out. And then, at Firebase Harrow, under a bulb that swung a little every time the generator surged, I signed the line. I am telling you all of this at the front, plainly, because I want you to understand that I was not a coward and I was not careless, and it will not save me. Both of those things can be true, and a man can still be wrong in a way that follows him for the rest of his life. I was wrong about the Wadi. I was wrong about the line I signed. And I was wrong, from the first hour I laid eyes on her, about who she was. They had sent her to us as an attachment. That was the word on the paper, attached, the way you would attach a trailer to a truck, a thing to be hauled and unhooked. Specialist support, the tasking said, which in our world meant somebody who was going to slow us down and get in our shots and have to be minded like luggage. When the resupply bird set her down at Harrow, she came off the ramp with 1 pack and 1 hard case, and she stood on the pad for a second getting the shape of the place, the wire and the towers and the burn barrel and the men, and she did not look impressed, and she did not look afraid. She looked the way you look at a room you already know the exits to. She was not big. That is the first thing every man on that firebase decided about her, and the last thing any of us should have trusted. She was maybe 5'6" with her boots on, lean in the way that is all tendon, and she wore her hair short and her gear plain, no unit flash, no patches that said a thing, a clean sleeve where a man like me carries a story. Her name tape said REYS. That was all we were given, and we would learn much too late, all we were meant to have. That's the specialist, Corporal Tull said next to me, not quiet enough. Tull was young and loud and good with a gun and dumb in exactly the way 23 is dumb. They flew that out here. Shut your mouth, I said, but I said it easy, and easy is its own kind of agreement, and she heard both the words and the ease. She did not react. She hitched the pack up and came across the pad and put out her hand and said, "Raise," and I shook it and said my name and my rank, Master Sergeant Aaron Bishop, and she nodded like she was filing it, and that was the whole of our first conversation. I gave her the cot in the Connects at the end because it was the worst cot and I did not think about it, and that is the point. You do 100 small unkindnesses to a person you have decided doesn't matter, and you do them without malice, which is worse than malice because malice at least sees the person. I did not see her. I saw a tasking. I saw a thing attached. For 2 days she was quiet and she watched. She ate at the edge of the table. She cleaned a rifle no one had issued her, her own weapon out of the hard case, and she cleaned it the way a surgeon washes, and one of the older men, Staff Sergeant Ochoa, watched her do it and said nothing to her and something to me later that I brushed off. She walked the wire at dusk. She stood in the operations tent during the briefs at the back where you stand when you are furniture, and she did not speak, and I mistook her silence for having nothing to say. The thing I keep is this. On the second night she came and found me at the map. We had a hunt on. The whole reason Harrow existed, the whole reason any of us were breathing that dust, was a man the valley called the Saber. His given name was Kadir Vaughn, and almost no one used it. He ran the Sadr and the passes above it, and he ran them the way a man runs a thing he built, patiently, cruelly from the inside, And for 8 months the campaign had been trying to put a hand on his shoulder and had closed on empty air every time. We had raided houses he'd left an hour before. We had the shape of him and never the man. He was the reason a fire base full of hard men went to bed angry. She stood at the map that second night and looked at the acetate a long time, the grease pencil marks of every place we thought he'd been, and she put one finger on a spur of high ground above a village we'd written off as friendly, a nothing place called Des Sabs, and she said, "You keep losing him west of here. He isn't going west. He's letting you think west." "That's so," I said. "The water's east," she said. "In summer he moves on the water. Everything he does moves on the water. West is where he wants your eyes." She said it flat, no push, the way you'd tell a man his boot was untied. Then she took her finger off the map and stepped back into being furniture. I looked at the spur she'd touched for about 3 seconds and then I looked away, because a master sergeant who has run this valley for a tour does not get schooled at his own map by an attachment 2 days off the bird. I want to be honest about the feeling. It was not that I thought she was wrong. It was that I could not afford, in front of my men and in front of myself, for her to be right. So I filed it under things a specialist says to seem useful, and I moved on. And in 3 days that decision would cost more than I have words for. The tasking came down on the 4th day. Signals had put the Sabre or somebody who mattered to the Sabre in a compound at the mouth of a side valley we called the Cut, west of Des Sabs West, where the specialist had said his eyes wanted us to look. I did not think of her when I read west. I thought, finally, a daylight raid in and out, a company slice with air on call. I built the plan the way I'd built a dozen, and I put her in the middle of the order of movement, between the machine guns and the trucks, where she could be minded. And when I briefed it and got to her slot, I heard Tull make a small sound, half a laugh, and I let it pass. She came to me after the brief. "You're going into the Cut from the south," she said. "That's the plan. The south approach is a funnel. There's high ground both sides and one way out, and it looks quiet because quiet is the bait." She said it without heat. "If he's in there, he wants you in the funnel. If he isn't, you'll walk in and find an empty house and a lot of eyes on the ridge, and the eyes are the point." "Noted," I said, and I did not note it. God forgive me. I heard a good soldier tell me exactly what was going to happen, and I filed it next to the last thing, under useful sounding. And I went asleep that night sure of my plan and my rank and my read on the ground. And every one of those certainties was a hand pushing us all toward the wadi. We rolled before first light. It was the kind of morning that is beautiful if you have the luxury of noticing, the sky going from ash to rose over the ridgelines, the cold that the desert holds all night lifting off the rocks in a thin haze. We came up the south approach into the Cut with the truck staggered, and the dismount spread and my head on a swivel, and it was quiet. And the quiet was exactly as wrong as she had said it would be. And I felt it in my back teeth, and I kept going because I had committed, and because turning a company around in a funnel is its own kind of death. The compound at the head of the Cut was empty. Cold stove, no dogs, the particular emptiness of a place left on purpose. I stood in the dirt courtyard for maybe 40 seconds. 40 seconds I have relived more times than I can count, with the read of it climbing up my spine, an empty house and a lot of eyes on the ridge. And then the ridge opened up. It came from both sides the way she said it would, plunging fire down into the bowl, and it was disciplined, and it was well-sighted, and it was the Sabres, and it caught us strung out in the one place we should never have been. The first burst took the lead truck's gunner. The second walked across the courtyard and put Ochoa down, and I heard him make a sound I will not describe. We fought. My men were good, and they fought, and we broke contact the only direction there was, which was the way we had come, back down the funnel, dragging our hit and firing up at muzzle flashes we could barely see against the brightening rock. I lost the thread of her in the first 2 minutes. That is the plain truth of it. In a fight like that you lose the thread of everyone who is not directly in front of you. You become a small, loud animal working the piece of the world you can reach. I was getting trucks turned and men loaded, and I was on the radio calling for the air that was 20 minutes out, always 20 minutes out, and somewhere in that the specialist, Ray's, the attachment, the luggage, went off my board entirely. We fell back down the wadi that fed the cut, a dry riverbed with cut banks higher than a man, and it was there, in the loose stone at the bottom of it, that it fell apart the rest of the way. A truck threw a wheel into a washout and hung. 2 more men were hit getting it clear. The fire from the ridge was finding us in the wadi now, ranging in, and I had 4 down and bleeding in the beds, and a company strung along a killing ground, and the hard arithmetic of it stood up in front of me the way it always eventually does. Someone was yelling that Ray's was back up the wadi. Tull, I think. Back up the wadi toward the guns, 150 meters of open stone raked by a machine gun that had our number now. Down, they said. She's down, not moving. I looked. I want you to know I looked. I put my glass up the wadi through the dust, and I found the shape of her against the pale stone, low, still, one arm out in the open, in the beaten zone where the rounds were kicking up rock in a steady line. And she was not moving, and she was not answering the net, and the machine gun owned every inch between us and her. And I made the call. You count the living. 4 men bleeding in the trucks who would die if we stayed. 20 more in the open who would die if we tried to cross that ground. 1 specialist down, not moving, not answering, in a beaten zone I could not suppress and could not cross. I have taught the arithmetic to younger men. I have stood in front of a chalkboard and drawn the ugly geometry of it. You do not trade the certain living for the almost certain dead. It is the hardest true thing in the work, and I believed it and I called it. She's gone, I said on the net, so my whole element heard it in one flat sentence that I would hear back in my sleep for the rest of my life. Ray's is gone. She's not coming back. We are exfil now, everybody moves. And we moved. We got the truck clear and the wounded stable, and we ran the wadi south with the air finally screaming in overhead to break the ridge, and we came out into the flat and kept going. And I did not look back up that riverbed again, because there was nothing back there to look at, only a shape against pale stone that I had already turned into a line on a form in my head. At Harrow, under the bulb that swung when the generator surged, I signed it. Killed in action. The pen skipped on the R I bore down and tore the small pit in the paper. The bird was inbound for our wounded, and the air was thick with the aftersmell of a bad day, blood and cordite and diesel, and men were sitting with their heads down in the way men sit when they have not yet decided how to carry a thing. And I told myself the arithmetic. I told it to myself the way you say a prayer you have stopped believing, over and over, to fill the space where the belief used to be. I did not know, that night, that I had just written the wrong name in the column for the dead. I did not know that 150 meters up a wadi in the failing light, a woman I had catalogued as luggage had been doing the oldest, coldest thing a soldier can do, lying still and letting the enemy believe her finished, and that she was, in the exact minutes I signed her off, already up on one knee in the dark, already reading the ridge, already beginning to take the whole thing apart. The bird took our wounded out that night, and 2 of them lived and 1 did not. And by the time the sun came up over Harrow, the fire base had that scraped-out quiet that follows a bad day, where men move slow and speak in short sentences, and nobody wants to be the first to say a normal thing, because a normal thing feels like a betrayal of the ones who aren't there to hear it. I did the paperwork. That is the part they don't tell you about, that after the worst day of a man's life there are forms, and the forms do not care. There was the casualty report and the storyboard and the after-action, and there was the KIA line I had already signed, and there was the matter of her personal effects, which under the connects at the end of the wire came down to 1 pack and 1 hard case, and a cot with a folded blanket squared away tighter than any of ours, because she had made it that morning before we rolled, the way a person does when order is a habit set so deep it survives the last day of a life. I opened the hard case. I told myself it was procedure. You inventory a fallen soldier's effects. You account for sensitive items, But the truth is I opened it because I wanted to know who I had left in the wadi, now that it was too late to matter. Inside was the rifle, of course, broken down, immaculate. A weapon built the way a very small number of men in the whole service are permitted to build a weapon, every part chosen and worked. And under the foam that cradled it there was a smaller compartment, and in it there was a challenge coin, plain, no unit crest I recognized, worn smooth on both faces the way a coin gets when a thumb has run over it 10,000 times in the dark before 10,000 hard mornings. And there was nothing else. No letters, no photographs, no name but the one on the tape, a person who had scrubbed herself down to a rifle and a coin and a squared blanket. Ochoa's replacement stuck his head in and saw me holding the coin and said, "Careful. Anybody know where she came from, Master Sergeant?" Before the tasking. And I said no because I didn't, and he nodded and left, and I sat in the connects with the coin in my palm, and the first true cold of the thing began to reach me, which was not grief yet, grief would come, but a much smaller and meaner feeling, the feeling of a man who has begun to suspect he threw away something he never bothered to weigh. Because a specialist does not carry a rifle like that, and a specialist does not read a valley off an acetate map in 3 seconds and call the funnel and the bait and the eyes on the ridge, all three, exactly, before it happens. And a specialist does not make a cot like that on the last morning of her life. I had told myself a story about her for 6 days, the luggage story, the attachment story, and the case in my lap was the first crack in it. And I closed the case and did not look further because I was not, that morning, brave enough to know what I had done. The days after ran together. We licked our wounds and we buried what could be buried and the campaign ground on, because the saber was still out there, and a bad day does not excuse you from the next one. And in the second week, something started happening in the valley that none of us could explain, and the not explaining of it is the thing I want to walk you through carefully, because I lived it as a mystery and only understood it as a proof much later, and I think you should get it the way I got it, a piece at a time in the dark, from the outside. It began with a name off the intelligence board. There was a man called Rahim who ran the Sabre's money through the bizarre towns down the valley, a careful man, insulated, a man we had wanted for a year, and never been able to reach because he never moved without a screen of guns and never slept twice in the same house. Rahim turned up on the track below Day Sabs, alive, sitting in the dirt with his hands bound in front of him and a card in his shirt pocket, and on the card, in block letters, was a grid reference and the word ledger. The local police found him. He would not say who had left him there. He said only, over and over, that it had come out of the ground in the dark, and he said it in the voice of a man who has met something he cannot fit into the world he understood the day before. Ledger. We ran it as a code word and got nowhere. The card meant nothing to any of us, but Rahim in the dirt with his hands bound was the most that had happened to the Sabres network in 8 months, and it had happened while we sat at Harrow, and it had happened without us, and the operations tent got very quiet the way a room gets quiet when everybody has the same thought and nobody wants to say it, because the thought was crazy. 10 days later it was the Sabre's cousin, the one who moved the weapons, a hard man named Faridun who had killed more of the valley's own than we ever had, and who traveled with a dozen fighters and slept behind walls. Faridun's dozen fighters were found scattered along a wash above the passes, disarmed, disoriented, some of them bound, none of them dead, and that was the detail that started to raise the hair on my arms, that none of them were dead. A raid kills. A rival kills. This thing did not kill. It took men apart, unstitched a warlord's inner circle one careful seam at a time, and left the pieces alive to be afraid, and Faridun himself was gone, simply gone, lifted out of the middle of his own guns in the middle of the night and not seen again. "That's not us," Tull said in the tent, looking at the board. "That's not the police, that's not the other valley." He was quieter than he'd been in weeks. The cocky had gone out of him in the wadi and hadn't fully come back. "So who is it?" Nobody answered. But I stood at the board and I looked at the grid references, Day Sabs, the wash above the passes, The water east that a woman had put her finger on in the dark and said everything he does moves on the water. And a cold thing turned over in me that I would not let myself name. The valley started to talk. That is a thing that happens in that country that we never fully controlled and never fully understood. The way a story moves through the villages faster than any signal we owned. And the story the valley told, that third week, was about a ghost. They said there was something in the high ground that came for the sabers men in the dark and made no sound and could not be killed. They said it had been left for dead and had risen. Some of them called it a word that meant reckoning. And the sabers men, who had held that valley by fear for years, began, for the first time, to be the ones who were afraid. And you could see it in the traffic, in the way they stopped moving at night, in the way the network we had chased for 8 months began to pull in on itself like a hand closing against the cold. I did not sleep well that third week. I had the coin from the hard case in my pocket. I had taken it, which is against every rule, and I could not have told you why except that carrying it felt like the only honest thing I had done since the Wadi. And late one night at the map, alone, I let myself put the two things side by side for the first time. A woman who read the valley better than I did. A ghost taking the valley apart the way you would if you had read it better than anyone. And I told myself it was impossible because I had watched her go down. I had put my glass on her, still in the beaten zone, not moving, not answering. I had signed the line. She was a shape against pale stone that I had turned into a form. The dead do not rise and take a warlord's kingdom apart seam by seam. I told myself that at the map at night, and the coin sat in my pocket like a small cold weight that did not believe me. Then the fragment came in. It was a signals intercept, a scrap, the kind of thing that crosses the board 100 times a week and means nothing. A burst on a frequency that should have been empty, too disciplined to be the enemy's, too brief to trace, and in it the analysts caught it and flagged it because it made no sense, a string of numbers and one word in English, clean, sent once and never repeated. The word was the same word off the card in Rahim's pocket. Ledger. And this time it did not go to the board and die. Because when the intercept hit the operations tent, it did something I had never seen a piece of paper do. A man was there that week I had not much dealt with, a quiet major from higher up who had flown in to understand why the Sabres network was coming apart without any of our forces touching it. And when the intercept was read aloud, that major went absolutely still. He did not go pale and he did not gasp. He went still the way you go still when a name is said that you were told you would never hear again, and he stood up and he said very quietly to the room, "Who has been running an authentication on the ledger call sign?" And no one answered because no one knew what he meant, and he looked at the intercept in his hand for a long moment, and then he said, more to himself than to us, "That's not possible. That element was pulled out. That element is not in this valley." "What element, sir?" I said. And he looked at me and something moved behind his eyes, some calculation about what I was cleared to know weighed against what was clearly already happening, and he said, "Master Sergeant, the specialist you lost. Raise. What exactly were you told about her?" "That she was attached support, sir," I said, "a specialist." And the major looked at me the way a man looks at another man who has been standing next to a live thing for a week believing it was a stone, and he said, "She was not attached support." And then he did not say anything else, because whatever she was, he was not cleared to say it in that tent, and the not saying told me more than any file could have. I did not get the whole of it that night, and I have come to think that not getting the whole of it at once was its own kind of mercy, because if a man had sat me down that week and laid out plainly who Reyes was, and set beside it the line I had signed, I am not sure I could have carried both in the same body at the same time. What I got, over the days that followed, I got in fragments. A word from the major, a thing Ochoa's old team leader let slip, the shape of a truth assembling itself in the corner of the operations tent the way a face assembles out of shadow when your eyes adjust. And this is the shape it made. She had not been sent to us to be minded. She had been sent to us to see. There is a kind of soldier the service builds only a handful of in a generation, and it does not build them loud. It builds them plain and quiet and deniable, and it strips them of the flash and the patches and the story on the sleeve precisely so that men like me will look straight past them, because being looked past is the whole of their armor and the whole of their edge. She had come off that resupply bird with one pack and one hard case, and a clean sleeve, not because she had nothing to show, but because showing nothing was the most senior thing about her. The specialist who stood at the back of my briefs as furniture was, on the actual org chart of the whole campaign, the one I was not cleared to see, the deniable command element the entire sadder effort had been built around. The hunt for the saber had not been assigned to her. The hunt for the saber had been hers. We were the visible part of a thing she was the quiet center of, and she had walked into my firebase and let me give her the worst cot and let a corporal laugh at her on the pad, and she had said nothing, because saying something was not what she was for. Her call sign was Ledger. The major finally gave me that much flatly, the way you hand a man a thing he has already guessed to spare him the indignity of guessing wrong. Ledger, because she kept the accounts. Because in a valley run by a man who thought he had erased every record of what he owed, she was the one who had come to collect it. And the name on the card in Rahim's pocket, and the word in the burst that stood the major up out of his chair, was her telling us, telling the exact people who had written her off, that the account was open and she was working it. I want to be careful here because the easy version of this story is a miracle, and Ray's was not a miracle, and it dishonors her to make her one. She did not rise from the dead. She was never dead. What happened in that wadi, I understand now, is the plainest and hardest thing in the whole account, and it is this. She had done, deliberately and with total discipline, the thing the rest of us were too loud and too afraid to do. When the ambush caught us in the funnel exactly as she'd said it would, she had not run south with the company. She had gone the other way, up, toward the guns, into the broken high ground on the flank, because that was where the fight could actually be turned, and she had known it in the first 10 seconds while I was still getting trucks pointed downhill. And when the machine gun found the wadi, she had gone to ground in the beaten zone and let it find her, let it put its rounds into the stone around her, let the whole ridge and the whole company and her own team sergeant believe her finished. Because a soldier the enemy believes is dead is a soldier who can move through his valley like water, and she had understood, lying still in the open with rounds kicking rock into her face, that I was about to hand her the most valuable thing I owned to give. The enemy's certainty that she was gone. She had heard me call it. That is a thing I made myself learn later, and I will not soften it. On the net, in the clear, my voice, one flat sentence: she's gone. She's not coming back. We are exfil. She had lain in the beaten zone and heard the senior man on the ground write her off in 5 words, and she had not moved and she had not answered because the write-off was the door, and she walked through it. While I drove south telling myself the arithmetic, she rose in the dark behind the ridge, alone, hurt. She was hurt. We found that out at the end. She had taken a wound in that first hour and worked 11 days on it without a word. And she began, with a rifle and a coin and whatever a person like that carries where the rest of us carry fear, to take Kadir Van's kingdom apart. Not in a night. That is the other thing the easy version gets wrong. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, patiently, from the inside, on the water and in the dark, one seam at a time. Rahim first, the money, because a network runs on money, and she read that the way she'd read the map. Then Faridun, the guns, and his dozen fighters left alive in the wash to carry the fear outward, because fear was the saber's own weapon, and she turned it on him with a precision that was almost courteous. She unstitched him. Over 11 days she took a man who had eluded a whole campaign for 8 months, and she reduced him, seam by seam, to a frightened man alone in the high ground with no money and no guns and no lieutenants, and a ghost in his valley that his own men swore could not be killed. And the ghost was a woman I had catalogued as luggage, and signed off on a form with a chewed-cap pen. The night the picture finally assembled in the tent, the whole of it, I went out and stood at the wire, and I was sick, quietly, in the dark, in the way a man is sick when a thing he did lands on him at full weight, Not because she had died. She hadn't. Because she hadn't. And I had spent 11 days as a man who had left a soldier for dead. And now I had to become, in one turn, a man who had left the most capable soldier he'd ever stood next to alone and wounded in enemy country, and who had been proven wrong not by a rescue we mounted, not by anything we did, but by her walking out of the grave I'd assigned her and doing the entire job by herself while we sat behind the wire and called her a ghost. 2 nights after that, the net came alive. I was in the operations tent when it happened, and I will carry the next 4 minutes for the rest of my life. It came in on a frequency that had been dead, a clean burst, and then a voice, a woman's voice, level, unhurried, a little rough with days of dust and pain and no water, but steady, so steady, the steadiest thing in the whole valley. And she gave the authentication, the string of numbers and the call sign, and the major came up out of his chair, and the young signals soldier at the set went white and looked around the tent for someone to tell him what to do, and the voice said, plainly, into a room full of men who had written her name in the column for the dead. Harrow, this is Ledger. I'm inbound to your south gate on foot. I have the package. Kadir Vaughn alive in custody. Do not. A small pause, and you could hear her choose the words for us, for the frightened boy at the set, for the tent full of men who had left her. Do not send anyone out. I'll bring him in myself. Ledger out. The tent did not make a sound. I have been in rooms after explosions that were louder than that silence. The major stood with one hand flat on the map table. Tull was by the entrance and his mouth was open and nothing was coming out of it. And I stood there with her coin in my pocket, the coin I had taken off a dead woman who was not dead, and I understood that she was walking up to the south gate of the fire base, where the man who signed her KIA line was standing, and that I was going to have to go out and face her, and that there was nothing on this earth I could say. I went out to the gate anyway. You do not make a soldier who has done what she did walk up to a closed wire. I stood the guard down and I opened the south gate myself, and I stood in the gap of it in the last of the dark before dawn, and the whole fire base came awake behind me and filled the wire. Word moving through Harrow the way it moved through the villages, the ghost, Ledger, she's alive. She's got the saber. Until there were 60, 70 men lining the HESCO and the towers silent, looking out into the gray where the ground fell away toward the valley. And then out of that gray she came. She came up out of the wadi country on foot in the flat gray light, and the first thing I saw was not her. The first thing I saw was him. Kadir Vaughn, the saber, the man a whole campaign had reached for and closed on empty air 8 months running, was walking in front of her with his wrists bound and a length of chain between them. Actual chain, the kind you'd find in a compound to hobble a gate, and I learned later she'd taken it off his own door, and he was walking the way a man walks when everything he built has come apart and he has had days to understand it, head down, hands out. Put one foot ahead of the other because a small, steady voice behind him has told him to. He did not look like a legend. He looked like a man being brought to account. And behind him, at the length of the chain, came Ray's. I almost did not know her. 11 days had stripped her down past plain to something elemental. Her plain gear was torn and stiff and dark down one side where the wound had bled and dried and bled again, and there was a field dressing at her hip gone brown, and she was thinner than thin, and her face was burned raw by sun and wind and cut in 2 places, and her lips were cracked white with the water she hadn't had. She had her rifle across her front on its sling, her hands easy on it, and she walked with a small hitch on the wounded side, and she did not look like a ghost, and she did not look like a miracle. She looked like a soldier at the end of the hardest work there is, coming home on the last of what a body holds in reserve, holding herself upright by the thing that no wound reaches. And she walked the enemy commander up to my gate on a chain with the exact composure she'd stood at the back of my briefings with, as if this were only the next plain task, as if she had never for 1 second been anything other than the most senior soldier in the valley. The fire base went silent. I told you I'd been in rooms after explosions quieter than the tent. This was quieter. 60, 70 men on the wire and the towers, and not one sound, not a word, not a boot-scraping HESCO. The whole of Harrow holding its breath as the woman it had buried came up out of the grave with the man it could not catch on a chain alone. I heard, somewhere down the wire, one man say her name once low raise, the way you'd say it in a church. She brought him to the gate and she stopped in front of me. Up close the cost of it was worse. She was swaying, just slightly, the way a tree sways that has held against a wind too long, and her eyes when they found mine were level and clear, and held no heat at all, none. Not 1 degree of the thing I had braced for and knew I deserved. She did not throw the waddy at me. She did not throw the KIA line or the worst cot or the corporal's laugh on the pad. She had every one of them in her hand, and she could have flattened me with any of them in front of my whole command, and she did not. She held out the end of the chain. "Master Sergeant," she said. Her voice was the voice off the net, level and rough and steady, pitched just for me. "Kadir Vaughn, alive and whole and yours to process by the book, a breath. He surrenders to the United States, not to me. Log it that way." And then, only then, so quiet that I do not think 3 men on the wire heard it, she said the one thing she let herself say about what I had done, and she said it not as an accusation but as a fact she was handing me to carry cleanly, the way she handed me the chain. "You called it the way the arithmetic told you to call it, Bishop. I heard you. It was the right call with what you had." A pause. "You just didn't have all of it." I have thought about those words more than any words ever said to me. She could have destroyed me, and she chose, instead, to hand me back the one thing I had lost in that wadi, that I thought was gone for good, which was the possibility of being a man who had made a hard call honestly rather than a man who had thrown a life away. She saved my standing in the same breath she brought in the enemy commander, and she did it because that is what the most senior soldier on a battlefield does. She does not spend her authority on the small satisfaction of the reckoning. She spends it putting her people back on their feet. She had done for me, at the gate, exactly what she had done for the campaign in the valley. She had kept the account, and then she had settled it clean. I took the chain. My hand was not steady and hers was, and I found, after a moment, that I could speak, and what I said was not adequate, and I knew it was not adequate, and I said it anyway, because a man owes the truth even when the truth is too small for what it has to carry. "I signed the line," I said. "I put you down as killed. I want you to hear me say it before anyone processes anything. I was the senior man and I made the call and I signed the line and I was wrong about you from the pad to the wadi, every hour of it, and there is no part of that I get to keep. That's mine. I'll carry it." And she looked at me, cracked and burned and swaying and steady, and something moved in her level eyes that was not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness was not hers to spend on a battlefield in front of my men, but was its close and harder cousin respect, given and not withheld, for a man telling the truth on himself in the open. "Then carry it right," she said. "Carry it into the next valley, and read the ground when the specialist tells you where the water is." The ghost of something crossed her ruined face, not a smile, the memory of where a smile would go. "You'll do fine, Master Sergeant. You just needed the map read for you once." Then her legs went. She had held it, all of it, 11 days and the wound and the water and the walk and the handoff, held it upright by pure discipline until the job was logged and the man was mine and the last plain task was done. And the second it was done, the body she had been driving on nothing let go, and she went down at the gate and I caught her. And she was so much lighter than a person that size has any right to be, and the whole fire base moved at once. What happened next is the thing I came here to tell you, more than the wadi, more than the chain. The medics came running and we got her down flat, and the doc got hands on the wound at her hip and started calling for the bird. And Vaughn stood forgotten on his chain with 2 men on him, and the sun came up over the ridgeline the way it had the morning we rolled into the cut, ash to rose over the high ground. And the fire base, the men who had laughed on the pad, the men who had given her the worst cot, the men who had heard me call her gone on the net and believed it, 60, 70 of them on the wire and the towers, The firebase came off the HESCO and formed up. No one ordered it. There was no order that could have made it happen, and no order could have stopped it. They came down off the wire and they formed a rough line along both sides of the ground between the gate and the medevac pad. And as we carried her through on the litter, filthy and wounded and barely conscious, they came to attention, all of them, and they saluted her, the ghost, the specialist, the attachment, the luggage ledger, the most soldier any of us had ever stood next to, and they held it, and the ones nearest held it longest. And I have never in my life seen anything I would trade for the sight of hard men saluting a woman on a litter in the first light, because she had walked their war back to them and said it, whole, at the gate. Tull was one of them. Corporal Tull, who had said that's the specialist. They flew that out here, not quiet enough, on the pad 6 days before a bad day. Tull stood at the edge of the pad with his hand at his brow, and his face wet and unashamed, and he held that salute until the bird was up and gone. And when it was gone, he stood a while longer looking at the empty sky. And then he came and found me and could not get any words out. And I told him there weren't any, and there weren't. She lived. I'll tell you that plainly because you have carried enough not knowing through this account, and I won't make you carry that too. The bird got her to the surgeons in time, and the wound that she'd worked 11 days on was as bad as a wound gets without being the end. And she was a long time mending, and I did not see her again for a good while. And when I did, it was in a corridor a world away from that valley, both of us cleaned up and in a place with floors, and she was walking on her own, and she saw me and stopped, and I did not know what she would do. She put out her hand. "Bishop," she said, just that. And I shook it, the way we had on the pad the first day, and I understood that she was giving me the whole of it back the day we met, before I had made her into luggage, before the cot and the waddy and the line. She was handing me the chance to have shaken that hand right the first time. I took it and I held it a second longer than a handshake, and I said the thing I had wanted to say for months, which was thank you, and it was not for the saber and it was not for the campaign. It was for the gate, for handing me back my standing when she had every right to keep it, for letting me be a man who made a hard call honestly instead of a man who threw a life away. She knew what I meant. She nodded once, the filing nod, the one I'd mistaken on the pad for indifference and understood now was simply a soldier taking in a true thing and setting it where it belonged. I kept the coin a long time. I meant to give it back, and every time I reached for it something stopped me, and eventually I understood what it was. The coin was worn smooth on both faces by a thumb running over it in the dark before 10,000 hard mornings, and somewhere in those 11 days in the high ground, working alone and wounded and written off, she had done without it, because I had it in my pocket at Harrow the whole time telling myself she was a stone. So I carry it now. Not as a trophy, it is not mine and I know it is not mine, but as the weight a man ought to carry who once wrote the wrong name in the column for the dead, and got shown, by the plainest and hardest and most disciplined soldier he ever stood beside, exactly how far short his certainty fell. There is a line on a form where you write that a soldier is not coming home. I wrote it once with a chewed-cap pen, and the R came out thin, and I bore down and tore a small pit in the paper. I was the senior man and belief was my job, and I believed the wrong thing. And then, in the gray before a desert dawn, the soldier I'd written off walked up out of the wadi on the last of what a body holds, with a warlord on a chain and a whole campaign settled behind her. And she handed me the chain and my standing and the truth in the same steady breath. And 60 hard men who had laughed at her came off the wire without an order and stood. She never once told us who she was. She let the work be the answer. And the work said, plainer than any file, in a voice the whole valley learned to fear and the whole firebase learned to salute. You do not measure a soldier by what she lets you see. You measure her by what she does in the dark, alone, after you've already written her name among the dead, and by whether, when she has every right to make you pay for it, she chooses instead to bring you your war back whole and set it at your gate. She chose that. Every time she chose that. And that is the one I'll salute till they write my own line on the form.